Alright, so we'll be doing our out-of-bounds exploration from the game's front to back, so we start things off on the lift that takes us down after the events of Chapter 3. Now if you watched my videos on Chapter 3, you may remember that by doing a trick or taking the camera up at the end, we could see that despite these sound effects, Kissy Missy is totally just chillin' up here. Well, if you were hoping for any Chapter 3 leftovers here, I'm sorry to say that if we take the camera way up in this tunnel here, there's just a whole bunch of nothing at the top, which isn't too surprising as there's no way the player was ever meant to get way up here. But despite this, when viewing this tunnel from a distance, it was honestly pretty cool to see just how massive this elevator shaft really is with respect to the rest of the area here. Then moving on to the control area down here, for the most part, the devs kept things pretty clean. Well, as far as out of bounds things go. One interesting thing here, at least to me, was to see how the developers created the cave effect here. When viewed in normal play, the player is given the illusion that the cave here is much bigger than it really is. As in reality, this is actually just a few planes of 2D textures, just offset from each other. Basic, but it definitely works pretty well. Next, we move on to the Toy Graveyard Mountains, just before the prison section. Unfortunately, there's nothing crazy hidden in the mountains of toys, and some may have doubted that these carts here weren't Barry as they're all face down, but if we take the camera underneath, we can confirm that these are indeed the fella. Now, whether or not one of these is the Barry that the player sends off in Chapter 2 is certainly up for debate, but my personal headcanon says yes. And actually I lied, there is something interesting in one of the mountains of toys here. So normally as you move up this section, a furry arm will flail before it then dies out. And at first glance, this appears to be an arm of a yellow version of Huggy Wuggy. Well, things get even more interesting, as if we take the camera under the mountain here, we can see that this is actually Kissy Missy's model, and the devs used her for this short animation here. And as you can see, Kissy is stretched out quite a bit as it looks like she's striking Michael Jackson's leaning pose from Smooth Criminal. And honestly, I thought it was pretty crazy that this is what they did to make this arm effect. Later in this area, normally the prison goes into lockdown as you approach the entrance, and this causes the massive main door to close shut. And although you can partially see what's inside from a distance before the door closes, you don't ever normally get a chance to have a better look. Initially, we can see a bunch of chairs that are outside the secondary gate here, and inside that, we can see more chairs, some desks, a bulletin board, and more. And then the rest of the room doesn't actually have a back wall, so you can just see out of bounds from here too. And although the contents themselves of this room aren't all that interesting, I think there's a decent amount of environmental storytelling here that's missed, as we can see that all of these chairs are thrown here to barricade these doors, to obviously try to keep out the monsters that were trying to get in. Of course, normally, prisons try to keep what's inside from getting out, instead of keeping outside elements from getting in, so just thought this was a cool little detail that's not really shown to the player. After this, we get to the train station area. If you were ever curious if there was anything hiding in the other jail cell cube things, although textured inside, there's a whole lot of nothing else. So really here, only the cell with the most visceral, disturbing environmental storytelling in the series so far, and the one you enter, actually have any other models inside of them. Oh, also in this area, out of bounds, a bit closer to the cave area, there's actually a misplaced model of a bed that seems to have a long default textured pole attached to it. Now into the prison we go, and I just made a short covering this a few days ago, and although not unused or anything, Limon the lemon actually returns in Chapter 4 here, and can be found a bit in the distance to the right after you enter the backrooms area after prying these planks off here. For the uninitiated, Limon is a secret lemon left hidden in the game by the developers as a little Easter egg. So I was really happy to see this goofball make a return this chapter, this time with a smile and some eyes. Anyways, lemons aside, back to the out-of-bounds stuff. Near where the player is able to get another red hand, under the floor, we can actually find our first bit of floating developer text of this video, as we can see it just below this battery socket, indicating that it's used to turn off one or more of the hand scanners above. And then, something similar is actually seen on the other side of this hallway under the floor too, only this time with a power puzzle panel thing, and here, one of the developers left explicit instructions to not delete this, as it's keeping the hand scanner above in an unpowered state. So if you ever wonder why on this series some objects may be left out of bounds by the developers, it's either A, they just forgot about it, or B, it's actually tied to some important function in the game. Also, in this same hallway under the floor, we can find a duplicate of the catnap toy that gets munched on by the critters as you first enter this hallway. And here, we can see that it's just constantly looping the animation of the raspberry jam gushing out of it. And as you've likely noticed by now, here we can also see numerous pairs of the nightmare critters that come out to attack you after you grab the red hand. Now, it may not seem all that crazy that these are loaded under the floor before they're called in the game, but this actually seems to be one of the few instances where they're loaded in like this, as in later sections where they appear, or even earlier ones like at the prison entrance, they aren't seen like this. And then lastly for this section, just behind this wall in the lower area where you have to escape the red gas here, there is just a lone pipe section chilling here in the void. Next, onto the warden's office entrance area. Just before it, we can once again actually see another object out of bounds that had some functionality related to the hand scanners. And this time, we actually have two objects here, the prison officer badge that's seen before and inside the warden's office, as well as this green cylinder here. So I'm not sure which of these is the one that's needed, could be both. Also, this may be patched by the time you're watching this video, but interestingly enough, some of the objects in this room would actually deload during normal gameplay, allowing you to see out of bounds with ease. And last up here, there's actually data left over in the game for various developer notes throughout this chapter. Most of them just indicate things like where triggers for pop-ups should be placed, like at the start to teach the player controls, or some context for what was planned to be added to a section later in development. Other times though, there are some more interesting things, like here for example, there's actually a note linking to some sort of developer document. Now before you go pausing the video to type this URL into your browsers, I already tried, and it just leads to a Confluence page, which is basically a workspace site which I guess the devs were using to collaborate, and unfortunately it's password protected. Yeah, sucks for us, I guess, but I'm not surprised at all that they don't want random people snooping around in there. Anyways, now onto the containment zone. Initially, we can actually see Yarnaby just chilling on the side of its cell. But as we approach, Yarnaby's model actually goes under the floor before he then jumps out of the cell towards the player, and after that animation is done, he will loop around back right to where he started out. After this are of course the various rooms where Yarnaby stalks the player, and there are several instances here where Yarnaby's model is loaded in. In the door where he appears out of initially, there's one in this area out of bounds, then there's one just floating here looking all nice and happy, and then yet another one that's not as friendly. And this one here appears to be the version of Yarnaby that chases you down this hallway. And similarly, there's also a model of Doughy above this area that's the one that helps you out here. Also for this hallway, I don't know about you guys, but I definitely thought that these boxes were something more important since they have the handprint on them, but outside of this room, I don't think they're ever seen again in this chapter. And if you were wondering what's inside of these boxes, since you go through this room so fast since it is a chase sequence, each of them actually contains a battery. Next up for this area, there's also a set of Doughy's arms from his monster form, including one doing an okay hand gesture. At first I thought these were unused until I remembered they do end up being used in the sequence with Doughy demolishing Pianosaurus, aka the most wasted character in the series. Like seriously, there was a whole teaser trailer for Pianosaurus, a catchy as hell jingle. as well as a cutout here, all for the fella to have like 5 seconds of screen time. Anyways, after Doughy busts him up, which looks way less frightening with the lighting disabled, these hands and Pianosaurus actually remain out of bounds here, with Pianosaurus ending up all mangled. But one of the hands is still doing the OK hand gesture here. The first instance, I thought it was just a coincidence, but this second time is making me think that this was left like this on purpose. Then after loading into the next segment, 2 of the Doughy's monster hands actually still remain way out of bounds here, but now they're just flattened out. And then further down in the distance, there are 2 more Doughy hands, this time in the regular form, and I can't really recall any instance where either of these sets of hands were used in the game. Then next, although not out of bounds, in this section where Doughy is peeking his head through a door as he waits for you, looking through the door, we can see that the way he's standing, if you want to call it that, is all messed up with the way his feet are positioned. And honestly, I thought this looked pretty funny. Next, before Doughy gloops through these bars, in the next cave section we can actually see that him in his bridge form is actually already loaded in under the floor here. And if we progress, after Doughy jumps down, we can see how the bridge form model just awkwardly floats up to where it needs to go. And while all of this is going on, far under the map we can find the Doughy that jumped down that's now all stretched out awkwardly like this. Then, interestingly enough, way before even getting to the next bit, the second circular bridge pad form of Doughy is loaded in there right away. Next we get to the prison recreation yard area, and although there's nothing really here out of bounds, if you were ever wondering what happens to Doughy after he gloops through the wall here, instead of the model just disappearing, Doughy kinda just chills here for a while as he talks. In the next area, just before dropping down to the gear maze puzzle room, to the left there's a large empty room where we can see a sideways floating model of Doughy striking a T-pose while holding a battery. And this is actually the model that's used when Doughy hands the player a battery below, and I don't know, I thought this was just pretty cool to see. After this is the section leading up to the safe haven, and here we can see another red dev note with another locked URL. And going forward, we can peep the hallway where Kissy Missy grabs the player to help us hide from the prototype that walks along after. Now, when playing this chapter the first time, I absolutely thought that there was a full 3D model of the prototype used for this cutscene. But as it turns out, if we take the camera closer and disable lighting, we can see that the prototype here is actually just a 2D effect that's projected onto the wall. Eventually, after moving, most of it will deload, only leaving this small chunk behind. Honestly, this absolutely blew me away when I first saw this, so kudos to the devs for making this effect look so convincing. Then before getting to the main safe haven area, I saw this model of a small mommy longlegs in this locker here, and it got me thinking whether this was a living thing or just a toy. I get that the devs probably didn't want to animate every single character in this area, and I guess it's implied that all the toys here are supposed to be living things, but the ones that are just static, like Mommy Longlegs here or PJ Pugapillar up here, it's honestly hard to tell. And if they are living things, why is this Mommy Longlegs hiding in this locker like this, especially since this is so hard to see under normal lighting conditions? Anyways, tangent over, now on to the safe haven. We got a lot to unpack here. For starters, there's another battery socket under the floor here just below the power generator. There's no accompanying text this time, but like the one we saw earlier, I'm assuming this is related to powering the hand scanner above it on the generator. Next, although you can kinda see into it from the main room, there's actually a normally inaccessible area in the safe haven here, and it's the storage room. Now, for whatever reason, there's just an invisible wall that blocks it here every time you visit this area, so you're never normally allowed in there, but the intended way of getting in there was for the player to open up this vent here to then crawl in there on their second visit through the safe haven here. Now, you can actually still pull off a part of the vent covering here, but then you can't pull off the second layer. So if you were ever wondering why you can randomly pull this off and it seems to make a ramp that should lead into the vent, that's why. But if we take the camera into this room, we can see that it was meant to be a cozy lounge area of sorts, as we can find a few characters just hanging out here, like this mini Kissy Missy here casually reading a book. And speaking of books, not unused or anything, since I believe you can also see these at the little shop area in Safe Haven, but these books here are pretty interesting. They all feature some cool artwork of various series characters, and this one even uses an asset from Project Playtime. What's extra interesting is that all the names on these books are actually current or ex-devs, just with the first letters of their first and last names switched around. For example, Jeth Sones is Seth Jones, Pika Mresciato is Micah Preciato from Zamination, and you get the idea. Just thought these were a cool little Easter egg the devs put in the game, and there are a lot of these books in this lounge room. But yeah, overall a super cozy little room, and I just think it's pretty strange that the devs were seemingly so close to implementing this room, only to seal it off with an invisible wall and janky second vent covering no less. Next, one of the most striking parts of the Safe Haven here are of course the art murals on the walls. And there are actually a few chunks of it that are never normally visible to the player as they're blocked off by some other objects like this tarp. And then just above here, normally you can only see the word he, but behind this beam we can see that the full message here is actually he is everywhere. And then we can see the arrows pointing to the eyes here, obviously representing the Doctor. Now next up for this area, we gotta get to the dev comments left in here, as they actually reveal even more cut things from this area. Namely, that there were actually plans for this chapter to have side quests, and several of them at that. Revealed in this note, for the player's first visit to the Safe Haven, they could have completed 3 optional side quests. 1, retrieving some sort of book for Doey. 2, getting a seemingly scrapped character named Izzy a birthday cake. And then 3, burning some rosemary to honor the dead, presumably at the Poppy altar area here. And that's not all, as there's actually another note here indicating that there would have been 2 more side quests planned that would have been seen on the second visit here. One side quest where you'd have to pose for another seemingly scrapped character named Ed, as he'd, I guess, draw a portrait of you, as well as a final side quest where you'd have to help Kickin' Chicken get his revenge in some currently unknown way. So yeah, before the toys here were just given a generic numbered name, it looks like some, if not all of them, would have actually had unique names. It's honestly pretty disappointing to learn that there was once so much more to this area than what we got. Now sure, this area is awesome and adds a lot to the lore and story, but I think it could have been much more. And it's sort of funny to me that these side quests were considered, as they seem to have involved at least maybe some sort of backtracking, which is something the developers prevent you from doing basically throughout this entire chapter here. But yeah, even if these were just small side quests, I think they would have went a long way in developing some of the characters here, and I think these would have made the player more attached to them, making it that much more impactful when the Safe Haven becomes less safe later on. Now, there's a bit more for the Safe Haven when you revisit it the second and third time, so we'll come back to that later. Next, we got the sewers, and if going through this tunnel from the Safe Haven to get there felt janky to you, there's actually a good reason why. Basically, there's a portal that instantly takes you from the upper section here to the lower area closer to the sewers. And thankfully, the coloring is a bit different here with the lighting disabled, so you can exactly see where this tunnel splits. And when viewed from the side, it's pretty trippy, as we can see the perspective of the area where you teleport to from up top here, revealing just how this dev trick was done. Now, the sewer area didn't really have much of note, except for another cool layered background effect that's used here to create the illusion of the cave area being much bigger. So now we go all the way to the wastewater plant, where first we can actually find a hand scanner under the floor just beneath where the power puzzle panel is near the door here, indicating that it looks like initially the player was just going to hand scan in there before the whole minecart power puzzle was added. Then next, in the no man's land area, it was honestly pretty barren out of bounds, just like the section is normally in the game. Now apparently Yarnaby was supposed to spawn in here, and it might be patched by the time you watch this, but when I first played through this on release, despite there being numerous gaps that the player was seemingly supposed to hide in, I never had Yarnaby or anything else chase me at all until the final segment. And speaking of which, being the second most underutilized character in this chapter, I gotta say the final chase with Yarnaby was quite underwhelming. But after Yarnaby catches fire and falls into the void, we can actually follow him and find a nice stretched out chain with Yarnaby on the bottom all mangled, with his front legs going through his face. Also, another interesting thing that happened to me in my first playthrough is that Yarnaby's model actually respawned behind me after I reloaded the checkpoint after his demise. He was just chilling there doing his thing, so in my headcanon, Yarnaby is still alive. Now, unfortunately, there's not all too much interesting to see in most of the areas leading up to the Doctor's headquarters. Sure, it was cool to see the operating area maze from a distance and have a closer look at the creatures in their cages or Baba Chops under the floor here, but yeah, nothing all too crazy. Well, I guess one interesting thing to see in this morgue room is just how far off the grab pack hand is from the body bag that it's supposed to be seen getting shot out from. In my first playthrough, I straight up thought this blue hand was a glitch, as it seemed to have just originated from nothing. Anyways, things get a bit spicier as we get to the Doc's HQ, as first, although we've mostly been seeing secrets under the floor, here just above the room there's actually a developer test note being just that. Then after getting to the top of the elevator here, there's a note for there to be a trigger here that would start to play a sound effect of bells tolling to be a callback to the Doctor's monologue as you ride up the elevator.
For whom does that bell now toll?
But unfortunately, I played through this again and listened pretty closely, and it seems like this idea didn't make it into the final cut. Nor did this only one path forward line that was planned to have been added by Eric True, one of the devs. Although the maze area with all the robots didn't really have anything crazy, going back to the Doctor, there are two more interesting dev notes here. One indicating the plans for what would happen as you first enter this room, and then secondly, hidden behind all the monitors is another note indicating the plans for the death sequence, which, although in a different order, seems to have been implemented just as planned. Now, on the second visit to Safe Haven, you get to go through this shipping area, and here we can see a note indicating that the purpose of the back part of this room is just for optional lore drops. Now, it's plural here, but in the final game, all that's there is just a VHS tape and a TV to play it in. Well, that, and I guess there's these Boxy Boo boxes here that are supposed to maybe have some lore implications, I guess. And although they lack any collision, if we take the camera inside, we can see that Boxy Boo is actually fully modeled inside here, similar to how he was in Project Playtime. Now, I have to believe that there must have been some sort of plans for Boxy here to pop out as an Easter egg or something, since he's modeled in like this. But yeah, unfortunately, there's no interactability that's normally offered to the player with these models at all in the final release of this chapter. Next, we go on to the Foundation area, and aside from seeing the cave maze from a distance, the only other interesting thing I found here was a pair of nightmare critters under the floor near the control room in the gas area. Now, in my playthrough of this chapter, no critters spawned in this room, so either there were once plans to have some of them in here as well, or these are for the cave area where you find the explosives just before this room, or in the room after where a few of them do pop out. Now back to the third and final visit to the safe haven. With the lighting disabled, we can see that Doey in his monster form was actually loaded and visible in the back in the shipping area as soon as I got here. I don't think I was able to see this in my first playthrough, so not really sure why this ended up happening here this time. Also, while the cutscene with Doey here was going on, I found another version of him in his monster form hiding not far underneath the floor. And then, after leaving this area and going up the elevator, we can take a look at how Doey tries to pull it down, which is never normally visible, And then, taking the camera back to the main safe haven room, I was able to see normal Doughy chilling here once again, as his animation seemingly reset under all the rubble even after it fell. And now lastly, we get to the final boss area, where just before heading in, there's actually an unseen computer monitor just underneath the console here. And after heading inside, unfortunately, there's not much to see here except for getting a closer look at these building things that are seen above here. And in case you were wondering, yes, these actually do have collision, so you can even walk on these railings if you can manage to get up here. And then for the last battery socket hidden out of bounds, just beneath the area that you get to after you get through the main part of Doughy's boss battle, there's another one of these that, once again, was used to limit the hand scanners above. I guess how they're kept powered off until you get close enough. An interesting way to do this for sure, but hey, if it works, it works. And now, last up for this video, we of course have the ending sequence, where first we have the cutscene with Poppy and Kissy, where one of the least surprising plot twists gets revealed. During this cutscene, when Poppy runs away to avoid being trapped back in her case once again, she runs off into the vent here. And if we follow to see where she goes, we can see that basically immediately after getting out of the player's normal view, she just instantly disappears. Then, after this, as the floor beneath the player collapses and Kissy tries to grab the player before her arm gets ripped off, if we take the camera back up, we can see that the devs stuffed Kissy into the vent here. So just like the cliffhanger we got at the end of Chapter 3, until we see an actual on-screen Kissy Missy death, I think she'll still be alive in future chapters, although now with one less limb it seems. And speaking of which, it looks like the arm that you see after falling isn't actually a unique model, as when we do go back to the main Kissy model up here, we can see that this is actually from this model, but it's just stretched out all the way down there, making her arm up here look pretty weird. And then finally, we get to the poppy flower growing room leading up to the science lab area of the Playtime Company factory that I guess we'll be visiting in Chapter 5. Or maybe not, since the player ends up getting bamboozled as OG Huggy Wuggy approaches us in another crazy cliffhanger. So of course, I had to try and get a closer look at Huggy here, and although it's not anything you can't normally see, it was nice to get up and close to the fella and have a better look at his model. And what else is interesting is that right after Huggy's jump scare here, he actually teleports into the room where the player gets locked in, and he will strike a solid T-pose. Now, normally it happens for only a second before it cuts to the credits, but if I pause the game, we can actually get a better look at the T-posing fella here in all his damaged glory. And damaged he sure is, as he's missing a hand. And if we look under this here wound dressing, we can see that there's even a whole chunk of him that's gone now too, which was pretty unnerving to see, honestly. I always had a hunch that the main mascot of the series had to have a return to the game since he's only seen for a few minutes in the first chapter. So yeah, I was really pumped to see him here, and I look forward to seeing what his role ends up being in Chapter 5. Alright, so for this chapter's unused maps, there are actually early blockout versions of almost all of the maps that you normally see in the game. As you can see, these contain a very basic version of the map, sometimes at least with a layout pretty similar to how it's seen in the final version, but sometimes not. And some of the maps even have two early versions of them left over, with one usually seeming to be an even more basic version of it. Anyways, just like the first video, we'll be going from the game's front to back, so we start things off here in the absolutely massive tunnel in which you're lowered down at the start of the chapter, where we can see a basic grid texture being used here. And you better get used to this texture, as we'll be seeing it a lot this video. Now, we didn't find anything at the top of this tunnel in the final version of this area, but I was curious, so I zipped on up there again, and although nothing crazy, the texture did actually change to a darker one up here, which hey, it ain't much, but I guess it is something. And actually, there is a bit more this time too, as there's also a second elevator platform up here too, just chilling in the void. Then as we get to the bottom of this elevator shaft, I mentioned some of these last video, but we can find our first leftover note from the developers here indicating that this would be a good place to put in a trigger to display some controls to the player, and it seems like this plan was executed for the release build. These messages we'll be seeing throughout these levels, and yeah, they basically indicate stuff like this or other plans and ideas that were yet to be implemented at the time that they were written up. After this, we can see that although there are various objects in this room, most of the actual level geometry is missing, so sometimes it's hard to piece together what is supposed to be where in these levels. But at the start here, with the crafty corn cutout and battery here, it looks like the layout is pretty similar so far. Now, what your eyes have probably been drawn to by now are the early pipes containing the red smoke, and getting a closer look, we can see that to simulate the red smoke effect, just a basic red grid texture slapped onto these pipes. Looks simple, but honestly, I think it also looks pretty cool. Another cool thing that's found throughout this area are these red mounds that, as you can see, are meant to be representations of a pile of dead toy bodies. And this has to be one of the most basic placeholder models that I've seen, at least for a while. And then near this mound, there's actually a dev note indicating that this was going to be where EA wanted to add a beautiful vista. EA is likely referring to the environment art team, and this vista seems to be the 3-layered cave effect we discussed in the last video that creates the illusion of the cave area appearing much larger than it really is. Then nearby, we can actually find a yellow dev note, something I haven't covered so far in these videos, and we can see this one here indicating that these rocks should be moved 1 meter away from their current position. Closer to the ending area, there is another dev note here indicating that near this big rock formation is where they were planning on adding the sidle lane that we see in the game. So I guess this map was made before that was even implemented. And then, after these basic looking desks here, that's about it for this first map. Well, except for the end here, under the door, with a burnable rope, we can actually see this little floating box, and glowing similar to the rope above, this actually appears to be a basic placeholder object for those that are burnable in the game. And we can actually still shoot this cube with the flare hand to prove this. Now after this area, we have the second early version of this map, and these second ones always have a baked after their usual file name, and as you can already see, the large tunnel at the start here isn't even modeled in, as we just have a basic representation of the lift with several platforms on the way up or down. Then at the bottom here, we can see that this is basically the inverse of the previous map, as here we lack many objects, but actually do have the area layout modeled instead. And if you were thinking, oh, maybe the two maps were to be overlaid or something, that doesn't seem to be the case, as where the objects were placed in the previous map doesn't appear to match up with this one. And this map actually appears to have an early layout of this area that differs from the previous map as well as what's seen in the final build. And although it's still somewhat playable here, there are so many missing objects and paths that lead to dead ends, so you can't really play in here for too long. Anyways, here we can see very basic representations of the first room with the cave view, as well as the last room of the area where the purple VHS tape is. A very basic but cool look at a very early build of this area. Moving on to the toy graveyard area leading up to the prison, we got several mounds here used as stand-ins for the toy piles, and hidden inside one of these is a dev note for a jump scare. There's surprisingly no placeholder model here for the prison itself, and after following the red smoke pipes, we get to the rail yard, where we can see a few more dev notes for various things like the boxes and cells in the area, and there's a very basic model of a control panel with a big red button that I guess was originally planned to have activated the train instead of the power puzzle that was eventually implemented. We also have a few other models chilling here, like a toilet, some beds that I believe are the same model, or at least use the same texture as that one bed we found out of bounds in the final version of this map. And then most interesting, I think, is that there's also an early, otherwise normally unused model of Riley here, the child that was transformed into a creature that we see meet a very sad and brutal end in the cell here in the final version of the map. And yeah, this more basic model can be seen here striking a T-pose near the toilet. So we can see that the devs were already planning on having this shocking part of this chapter at whatever point this map was developed. Then for the baked version of this area, we don't even have any placeholders for the piles of toys at all here. Just some orange platforms leading up to the prison, which does have a placeholder model, and even a small room that we can check out inside of it. The rest of the area is pretty empty. We can see several platforms slapped in here for the cave section, and then getting to the train area, all we have is another orange platform here, but this time we also have an early version of the small room where you end up starting the puzzle to power the train in the final game. Now onto the prison interior, we get to see a lot of early models here, from the prison cells being basic cubes just with a more finished door. Although a terminal is modeled, there's another placeholder red button podium here, and the models for the hand pusher things are incredibly basic as well. And interestingly, although in the final game these are color-coded to their respective sections with only blue and red hands seen in each, in this early map we get a mix of both of them in the same area. Here we can also see several dev notes for entry tunnels and jump points for the critters, I guess specific points where they could jump. And then under this area are several things that we also saw in my last video, like this battery socket and power puzzle panel, both with their accompanying dev text, as well as these numerous pairs of nightmare critters. So I guess all of those objects we saw in the final version of this map were actually carried over from this earlier version. Then moving along, we get to the warden's office area where we can see several basic chair models, as well as some developer text, this time used as a placeholder for the security disc puzzle to unlock the warden's office. Here we see the goal was to spell out PSF, I guess Playtime Company Security Force or something. And then around the area we have placeholders for the discs just being letters S, W, and Z. So obviously in this instance, the player would have had to grab and insert the letter S. Then nearby are several of these spiky objects, I'm assuming stand-ins for all the dangerous debris that the player has to squeeze through in the hallway with all of the less than alive security guards. And then lastly for this area, we have a really early version of the second cell block. As if the previous one wasn't basic enough, here the cells don't even have the more finalized doors on them. And then at the end here, it looks like a dev was really happy to indicate where a red hand scanner should go. What else I found interesting is that although there are still some early red smoke pipes nearby, here is the first instance in these early maps that we can see some pipes using the finalized red smoke effect in these windows. Now this is the first map so far to not have a second baked version of it left over, so now on to map number 4, the containment zone. Starting here, we can see an early version of the puzzle room where you have to block the closing doors with some cubes. And then we get to the main containment room, where we get to see a very basic mock-up of Doughy's cell, with, I guess, these 3 colorful bars meant to represent gloops of his dough left behind. And then we also get to Yarnaby's cell here, that's a bit further along, as we can also see some dev notes here, as well as an early, but honestly not that bad looking rig for the battery puzzle. And of course we also get to see a static model of Yarnaby just chilling here as well. The next area, where Yarnaby stalks you in the game, is surprisingly pretty close here in terms of layout and where things like the flammable boxes are, and here we can even see some dev text indicating a flammable object. In fact, it looks like all of the Yarnabys here in this area, and even the Doughy up here, are all in the same spots where we found them in the final version of this area. The Yarnaby chase hallway is pretty similar, just it doesn't have as many objects here, and then under the map, we can find a few objects from the archives room, and most interestingly, there's a dev note here for the next section that refers to Pianosaurus as Piano Dino instead. Pianosaurus, I think, definitely rolls off the tongue better. And for those of you that were thinking that Pianosaurus's involvement in this chapter was cut closer to release due to time constraints or something, I guess this note seems to reveal that Pianosaurus's short appearance in this chapter was planned for at least a while. Anyways, next we get to the prison utility zone map, and before we get to the rest of it, since there's no floor here, several objects immediately start falling into the abyss as soon as you load in here. Namely, several Doughy models that are seen throughout this area. and they kind of just ragdoll on their way down, so if we pause the game and have a closer look, yeah, the models look all deformed and pretty cursed, to be honest. Like with pretty much all of them, we can see Doughy's red teeth that are normally seldom seen in this chapter, and yeah, this just looks crazy. Another pretty crazy thing that happens here is that these chains just start to fall, and they just do that infinitely. I guess making the model larger and larger, and the longer I waited here, the harder and harder my PC had to work to run the game. And after a while, it got so bad that I ended up having to delete these to get things back to normal. Anyways, back to the start of this area, here we can see a dev note that indicates the dialogue where Doughy mentions the interrogation rooms. But interestingly, it mentions that this was supposed to be optional, but in the final game, I believe you have no choice but to enter these side rooms to trigger this dialogue. Then moving up a bit, here we can see a dev note referring to Doughy passing through this gate as just spaghetti. And honestly, I think spaghetting is an awesome description for this. Next, off in the distance, here we can see some dev text for Safe Haven Buildings, and this looks to be a placeholder for the Safe Haven text, which can be seen on the wall here in the final version of this map. And then eventually we make our way to the recreation yard area, where the dev notes here reveal some more scrapped ideas. For example, this one references a minecart which would be covering one of the chains the player needs to open the next door here. Although this minecart seems to have been kept here in the final cut, all of the chains are accessible right off the bat. And then lastly, for this version of this map, we have the gear puzzle area. And although the layout is obviously unfinished here, the idea of it looks to be the same. Next, we actually have a baked version of this map left in the game, where much like the previous ones, we can see an early layout for the area, including incredibly basic models for the interrogation rooms. The bars that Doughy spaghettis through are represented here with smaller bars going vertically and horizontally. We can see a pair of basic blue disc placeholders for Doughy in his circular form here. And of course, we got a very early layout for the recreation yard. Here we can see some incredibly basic block models representing the chains and their spools. Each of the towers are empty on the bottom, and then at the top of the blue tower we can see a very early representation of the code terminal, as well as the colorful hint for it. Maybe one day the color sequence will actually match that of my channel. As we leave this area, we can see a small crack in the wall, I guess being a placeholder for where Doughy goops through the wall here, and these doors are translucent here, giving them a pretty cool look. And then after getting through some more basic hallways here, we once again get to the gear maze puzzle area, where we actually get to see more of these semi-see-through walls, and honestly, I love the way this looks. I think a full game in this style would be super cool to see. In this room, we can also see some basic geometry for the gear puzzle, as well as the gears themselves that are scattered in the maze in either yellow or white. And to wrap this area up, we can also see the door that the gear train opens, indicated here in yellow as well. Before we go on, just want to give a quick shout out to my channel members like Corbite and Poog. If you'd like to help support the channel and get some extra channel perks like the new LIMON emote, check out the join button below. Now next up, we have the safe haven, as well as the area leading up to it, and there's quite a bit to unpack here. After seeing a very early version of the kitchen area, as well as the shower room, we get to the main safe haven, and right away, after seeing some dev notes of where to put stuff like soccer nets and laundry lines, you'll notice that two of these smiling critter toys here have yellow names above their heads. We got a Bobby Bear Hug named Izzy here, as well as a Picky Piggy, just known as, well, Piggy. Now, if you watched the first video I made on this chapter, you'll recognize the name Izzy, as Izzy was actually directly referenced as a character in one of the side quests that was once planned for this section of the game, where you'd have to go and get Izzy a birthday cake. And then, although Piggy isn't named on the note with the scrapped side quests, there's another note in this early safe haven map that indicates that Piggy here would have the rosemary that you'd have to burn to honor the dead in the third cut side quest mentioned here. So, although it looks like Piggy remains in the final version of the memorial room here, of course the side quest and associated dialogue for it were scrapped. Here we can also see an old version of the generator with just some power puzzle panels, a lever, as well as just a cylinder slapped onto it as placeholders. Near this area, there's a dev note indicating that the vent path that you take to return to this area the second time was originally planned to be hidden by a poster, and I don't know why this idea was cut, since you can just enter this vent normally, but then you can't go up at the end of the starting section from this side, so this could definitely confuse some players. And then beneath this area, under where the floor is supposed to be, we also have several character models. And these include Poppy, Kissy Missy, a massive Doughy that looks to be like 2 to 3 times larger than he's normally seen here. And then we also have not 1, but 2 untextured models of Doughy in his monster form. I suppose indicating where his position was planned to be when first transforming in the main room, as well as his second location where he spawns closer to the elevator as you try to escape. And also in this section, we've mentioned 2 of the scrapped side quests so far, but it looks like remnants of the third one can also be found here, as we can find a dev note indicating a location for a notebook for Scout, the boogie bot that seems to be in charge of Safe Haven's security systems. Now, in my first video, I mentioned how one of these scrapped side quests was for the player to find a book for Doughy. So it's very possible that this is where the book was meant to have been placed, and perhaps before that idea, this book in question was this notebook mentioned here, and the player would have had to bring it back to Scout instead of Doughy. Anyways, there's also a basic implementation here of the elevator, as well as the cable car room above, which it takes you to. Now, a big thing I discussed in my first video was the normally inaccessible storage room in the safe haven, where we saw some characters chilling in what looks to be a cozy library room of sorts. And here, we have a note revealing that the original plan for this area was for it to be barricaded, and that, just like I mentioned in my first video, the plan was for the player to find a secret entrance to this area by pulling off the cover to one of the vents, something that you can actually still do in the release version of this chapter. Now, as I discussed, they blocked the vent with another vent covering that you can't remove. And I don't know if they were just super rushed or something, but they didn't even end up barricading this door and just left it awkwardly blocked with an invisible wall instead. And it kinda looks like the plan for this room was a bit different at this point when this map was made, as we can see several basic shelving units here, making it seem more like just a typical storage room rather than a cozy room that it was made to be. And here we can also find a dev note that reveals that this storage room was initially planned to have the cutout of Doughy, which ended up getting moved to the starting area of the wastewater plant section. And now lastly for this early safe haven map, we have the infirmary wing, where first we can see a note indicating that there was once planned to be a medic bot cutout here, and this ended up being replaced with the Dog Day one that's seen there. And then at the end of this hallway, we can find a very basic rectangular representation of the tunnels that lead to these sewers. And then we can also see that even back when this early map was put together, the devs were already planning on implementing a portal in this tunnel, as I went over in my first video. And if that wasn't enough for the safe haven, it also has a more basic baked version as well, where we can see a very basic build of the areas surrounding the safe haven, like the kitchen. We can get a neat look at the shower area here, the infirmary, the shipping area with this green rectangle, I guess representing the note that can be found there, or the book that we just mentioned earlier. We got a very basic area for the cable car, and even here we also see the storage room and the vent that you'd enter it from, with I suppose this blue rectangle here being the Doughy cutout that was planned to be added. And then lastly here, we of course have the main safe haven room, with some more really basic rectangular placeholders, including some basic beds, these boxes that are I guess supposed to be the soccer nets, and then there are also these red panels that appear to be the vent coverings that would lead to the storage and shipping areas respectively. The safe haven is definitely an integral part of this chapter, it being in the name and all, so I'm super glad there was so much to discuss here for it in these early maps, and I think it's really cool to see it in these early states to just really appreciate just how awesome it ended up looking in the final cut. Now moving on to the sewer area, we pick up right where we left off from the previous portal text, as this map has some here too. Here we're back to seeing the early placeholder models for the red smoke piping, and parallel with it, We also see these blue pipes, and although they don't seem to be anything special in the final version of this area, based on their coloring, these may have been meant to represent the pipes that are pumping the liquid nitrogen through the facility seen later in the chapter. And then later on, we also have a yellow pipe section, which I don't know why this could have been color-coded like this, but I'm sure you can think of at least a few yellow liquid possibilities. Next, on the two paths going left or right here, at their end, they each have a dev note indicating plans for the environment artist to add some environmental storytelling here. And I don't think I remember anything really here that was added in respect to storytelling, except I guess this barricade and maybe the glitchy view into the cave distance here. Then next up we get to the wastewater plant area, and here this dev note reveals that this was from a point before it was even fully decided how the player was going to get here. In this room, there's also another interesting message from the devs that mentions the lore note that's left here in the game, and that it was originally planned to be found in the sewer room instead. But I just thought it was funny that the devs explicitly indicate that, quote, fans love Easter eggs like this. Well, do you? After this, we get to the minecart track section, and here, in addition to a T-posing Doughy, we can find several dev notes as well as this floating dev text indicating where the foundation area was planned to be. One dev note here indicates that before a power puzzle was implemented, a red hand scanner was going to be used to open this door instead. But after the player's first visit, it would get busted up. Truly so sad. Press F to pay respect to the red hand scanner. Then we can see this minecart model that I don't believe ended up getting used in the final game, and apparently there was once planned to be a VHS tape for the player to find here. And the body of this note here doesn't look like it was actually edited, as it looks like it just has a default message on it. And lastly for this area, we have some dev notes relating to making sure that the safe haven area remains visible from the lower section for the climax of the game, where it explodes. And yeah, the devs were pretty keen on not blocking this view. And further here, we can find a note that the devs were still determining just how far away safe haven would be, and near here as well, there's also a waterfall with some dev text on it indicating exactly what it is if you couldn't already tell. Now, a waterfall is still present in the final version of this area, it's just a bit hard to see under normal lighting here, and it's definitely not as vibrant as this one here. Moving on, next up we have the No Man's Land section of the game, where in this blockout map we get lots of orange. But surprisingly, a lot of things are pretty much where they're seen in the final version of this area, and several things are even still functional here, like being able to actually swing across this gap. There was a trigger for some Yarnaby sound effects as I slid down this ramp. And even grabbing and using this keycard worked here to open this door. Now, unfortunately, there's still a bunch of the level missing, so it's not fully playable, but definitely a step above pretty much all of the other early maps I've covered so far, at least in terms of playability. Here we can also see several instances of Yarnaby loaded in, and this model is even functional enough to jump scare us, unlike the other ones we saw in prior maps. In this map, we can also see several early spots made to hide from Yarnaby here, with most of them even indicating their exact measurements, which, if you were curious, they're 1 meter wide, 2 meters tall, and 2¼ meters in depth. And yeah, although the power rerouting mechanic isn't functional here, it was still really cool to run around in this area and see the early models, and the early signs on the walls using that default Unreal Engine font that I love seeing in these games. Then, after getting through this door, although the chase with Yarnaby didn't start fully, maybe since I didn't have the red hand here, after getting to the end of this section, we can still swing across here, and this will actually still trigger the Yarnaby death sequence as it plays out just like it does in the final game. Only this time, he catches fire for literally no reason at all, as there's not even a container of molten metal or whatever near him this time. Then after this, I was pretty surprised to see that not only does this next door still work, but so does the tube capsule thing that takes you back up to the start of the area. And on top of all of that, the whole interaction with Doughy and him getting frozen here still works completely as well. Now, before we get to the next area, I didn't mention this in my previous video, but the No Man's Land area is listed as the 9th map in the game. And the next one after this is numbered as the 12th map, suggesting that there might have once been a 10th and 11th map planned for the game that ended up getting cut. In any case, next up for the game's 12th map, we have the Doctor's Domain, where we start off in this transport checkpoint area, before we then get to the room with all the pipes transporting the liquid nitrogen. And if you were doubting that the blue freezy stuff was liquid nitrogen, it's actually confirmed here in these dev notes. Here we can also see an early model of the flow seals, and when I first saw this, I immediately thought that this looked like a single-arched Happy Meal box. Anyways, next we get to the morgue room, where right away you'll notice several of these basic-looking human models, I guess used here as placeholders for the body bags that are seen in the room in its final version. And I'm fairly certain that these models are actually the same ones that we saw left over unused back in Chapter 2 for the early precursors to Project Playtime. The layout is also a bit different in this area, with the capsule containing the lungs being seen on the opposite side here compared to where it is in the final game. And it looks like how the player was going to cut the grab pack hand cable was a bit different too. Instead of just moving the saw to cut the cable, this dev note reveals that originally the plan was for the player to have burnt a rope holding up one of the body bags, and the bag falling to the ground would have caused the grab pack hand cable to, I guess, fall into the saw, which I suppose would have been stationary. What I think is most interesting in this room though is that there's this weird model of a hand with what looks like a key of some sort poking out of its shoulder. Now at first I thought this was Huggy Wuggy's arm, but it looks far too short and it looks like it has a sleeve. So honestly, I'm not 100% sure who or what this is from, but I'm assuming this is slapped in here as a placeholder for the extra blue hand required to get through this area. But also, there was like a secret jester-like character that was teased for this game in an ARG leading up to its release that we never ended up seeing in Chapter 4 here. And this shoulder, certainly, to me, looks like it could be for a jester, so perhaps this is a remnant from that character who maybe we'll end up seeing in future chapters. Then, after seeing an early model of the cable car here, we get to the secondary lab, here referred to as the Classified Research Center. And right away, you'll probably notice the early model of Riley that we saw earlier, and as indicated by the dev note here, the goggles on this model's head are a placeholder for the gas mask. Then behind this, we can see early models of the air filter dispenser, the lockdown protocol control console, as well as the CCTV monitors here, some of which actually use a photo of some kid as a placeholder. These photos are so close to the end of the monitor texture, so it was hard to get a good look at it, especially in a way that was a bit more flattering. But yeah, this is the photo that's used here on a bunch of the monitors, and I have no clue who this is. Maybe a childhood photo of one of the devs or something. Then the actual maze section here wasn't much of a maze yet at this point in development, and there are several pretty interesting differences here. For one, the second and third operating rooms in this area are specifically referred to as male and female autopsy rooms respectively, something that I don't believe is indicated in the final game. Then, each of the toys that you need to find in the maze are completely different here compared to what was finalized. Instead of the ones seen in the final version, here we have a Kick Me Paul, Cat Bee, Candy Cat, Daddy Longlegs, as well as a Sir Poops-a-Lot. Now, I don't know if these were changed since they were considered lesser-known characters in the series, but I think we need more Kick Me Pauls and Candy Cats in these chapters, not less. Also, if you haven't noticed, each of these characters has completely different subject numbers than the ones that are used in the final cut of the game too. Additionally, there's a dev note here indicating that the locations of the target toys was planned to be randomized unless complications occurred. I guess complications occurred. Next up, there's an early version of the hallway with the monitors here, and according to this dev note, the original idea for these was to display the Doctor's watchful eye, with it blinking and even crying, which would have been pretty cool to see, though I don't think the Doctor is one for displaying any emotion. Next up, there's the room with the preserved liver, and I just love how across from it is some big text just saying, "High voltage." And then last up for this area, we have the section that the player drops down to after the Doctor sets an electrical trap on this handle. And according to this dev note, the plan for how the player would proceed from this area used to be a bit different. Instead of just powering on the next door to proceed, the player would have actually needed to trap Baba Chops back in the shock treatment cell. And strangely, in this map, there are 2 sections here labeled as a shock treatment cell. But obviously, this is the one that ended up being developed, and here we can see some early models of the shocking coils just using the regular power puzzle nodes. And in these bins, we can see these red things, which at first, from a distance, it looks like blood, but these are actually listed in the game as a pile of hair, and they're related to the early model of Riley. Next, this area also has 4 sections, one in each corner of this area, with some arrows pointing upwards, each leading to a pipe section of some sort, and each of these is labeled as a Feed 'em 4000. Now, whatever these are, they were definitely cut from the game as they don't exist at all in the final versions of this map, but I can only speculate that they must have had something to do with the Baba Chops encounter here. Also in each corner of this area are 4 of these shower things that I guess were used to decontaminate employees working here, as each of these has an accompanying sign indicating that employees were to rinse immediately if exposed to any secretions from the subjects that they were studying. And then lastly, for what I thought was interesting in this map, instead of having a teeny tiny Simon Smoke trapped in the canister, here we can see it containing the same basic human specialist model we saw back in the morgue. And this definitely got me thinking whether initially the plan was for the player to have made the choice to either kill or spare a human to progress in the game, rather than just a small critter. Now this would have, of course, been several magnitudes darker, so I'm not too surprised that the devs changed this if that was indeed the case. Next up, we have the Doctor's headquarters, or lack thereof. Yeah, oddly enough, although there is still a blockout map for the Doc's HQ left over in the game, it's only 1.5 kilobytes in size, and it's completely empty. So on to the next one, we have the Foundation. Now, compared to most of the previous maps we've checked out, this one is much smaller. Here we can see an early layout for the cave section that appears quite similar to how it's seen in the game, and we can also see some early models for where the player finds the explosives. And then getting to the main part of this map, we can see an early version of the gas flow puzzle here, with a bunch of dev text around the area, labeling things like local lantern lighting, deep mining operations, IT center, and more. And it looks like all of these signs did end up getting developed for release. And although lacking the pipe sections labeled A, B, and C, and using some early models here for the T-valves, the actual pipe layout appears to be the same here. What's most interesting though is that above this map in the void, there's actually a pipe layout that looks quite a bit more complicated, perhaps an early version of what ended up getting implemented. And now, getting to the game's climax, we load into the starting area leading up to the doughy boss pit. And to start, we can see several dev messages indicating the plan for the cave collapsing to block the player's path where the critters are seen in the chase, here all represented with some Bobby bear hugs instead. Then getting closer to the pit, there's a message here that indicates that a simple button was initially planned to open the door to the pit instead of the hand scanner. And we can see this large magenta square thing here that I guess indicates where the door and trigger point for starting the final boss were to be added. This note by the square also lays out a different plan for the cutscene, where Doughy was initially going to steal a lever near the exit door of the pit to trap the player inside, instead of Doughy just dropping down right beside the player as is seen in the final cut. The pit itself isn't all too crazy, as it seems to have the same general layout, but of course we can see various placeholder models like these jail cell doors around the middle, and the tunnels going between the different levels in the pit are nice and janky as well. One of the tunnels also has a nice big X floating in the middle of it, I guess indicating that was designated to be caved in or something. And lastly for this map, we have the area where Doughy gets squished, and there's not too much left here, but we do get to see some floating magenta dev text just labeling this gas here as leaking liquid nitrogen, which of course did make its way to the final cut. Then after this map, we also have a baked version of it, which unlike pretty much all the rest, the baked version here actually seems to be a bit further along than the other one, as we have more models, as well as a proper layout of the starting area here. Even some cool effects are added at this point, like this electrocuted pool of water. We see the Bobby Bear hugs again, but this time also mixed in with some of the other critters that are seen in the final cut of this area. And yeah, this one's looking just overall much closer to the finished product. It's almost like a hybrid of half finished, half placeholder. But aside from a bunch of these yellow placeholder tiles around the map and some more colorful basic objects in the middle, there's not all much else that's all that crazy here. And now for the final early map, for those that are visited in the game, we have the area leading up to the labs. And the first interesting thing to see here is this early section of the ventilation block, where we can see a model of Poppy, Kissy Missy like face planted downwards, and honestly, I'm surprised that they even animated this placeholder fan here. It should also be noted that this is a different Kissy model than what's normally seen in the game, as I suppose this default one was used as they probably didn't finalize Kissy's damaged model from this chapter yet when making this blockout map. Anyways, after dropping down to the area below, we get some more dev notes providing context for how this map was to be developed, some more dev text for floating dust, and then we of course get to the poppy flower growing area, where here they're all just represented with some translucent red blocks like this. Then, towards the end of this room, we can see this canister of red smoke that, according to this dev note, was used for subduing toys while leaving or entering the labs. Now this canister is still in the final version of this area, but it's just there, and I don't think it even has any red smoke in it, so I definitely didn't even pay attention to it, but it looks like it was originally planned to draw more attention to itself. And then lastly, we have a big sign indicating that this door leads to a Lab 4, which I don't believe is explicitly revealed in the final game. But I guess based on this, there's a good chance that this is where Chapter 5 will take place, unless our protagonist gets dragged away somewhere else due to the events of the ending. And here we also have several more dev notes for the airlock doors and benches, and then also some basic models for the final VHS tape, VCR, as well as a pair of TV screens that I guess were replaced with the one here for the final cut. And oddly enough, there's actually what looks like a duplicate of this area, but just with one placeholder TV found just on the side, which was pretty strange. Now it was honestly such a treat to explore all these early levels. Seeing them from a much earlier point in development and seeing what parts were kept and which were altered or scrapped definitely gave me more appreciation for the final product. So yeah, I'm definitely pleased that the devs decided to leave these in the game. And now last up for this video, if all of those weren't enough, there are actually also several normally unused maps with Profiler in their name. Anything from a character profiler map to audio, VFX, and then also one for every level in the game too. Now these all appear to test various things and I guess how they would impact the game's performance, as loading into each of these also brings up a bunch of debugging info on the right side of the screen here. These are all also pretty wonky, as once all the tests the map performs in a given area are done, it would just auto-close out of the game after. Anyways, the non-level ones are much shorter, just showcasing some animations and VFX, and the character profiler doesn't appear to be complete here, as even the title cards aren't changed from their default text it seems. And then for the profiler maps for the levels that are seen in the game, it basically teleports the player every few seconds to a different area of a given map, and then the subtext on the top right here basically indicates what the developers were looking at a given section. Be it distance, room checks, checking some level set pieces like the toy piles here, and more. For the most part, the levels seemed to be the same, only the one for Dowie's boss fight was one to use an early version of a map. So for these, nothing really that we haven't gone over already, it's just I haven't really ever seen something like this while making Lost Bits yet, so I just figured I'd share it with you guys as well. Alright, so to kick things off for this video, one thing that a bunch of people commented on my first video regarding the planned side quests that were scrapped from the game was for the Ed being mentioned here. And yeah, keen fans were quick to point out that there's actually an odd Ed character that can be found in the safe haven. And it's this crafty corn here that just says something about being able to trust Poppy after she returns.
Can we really trust her this time?
And as we saw on the developer comment in the first video, the player would have had to pose for Ed to draw a portrait. So this Ed being a crafty corn artist checks out. But why Ed is referred to as Odd Ed is unfortunately still a mystery, as this one line from this Ed is all we end up getting in the release version of this game. And then speaking of the characters and scrapped side quests in Safe Haven, now's a good chance to segue to going over some unused audio left in the game, as we got some relating to both of those things. First, we actually have some unused dialogue left over for Izzy, another character mentioned as part of the scrapped side quests, where the player was going to be tasked with getting Izzy a birthday cake. Now this unused dialogue doesn't refer to the cake at all, but rather it's actually a conversation this Izzy would have had with Scout, the little boogie bot that's seen in Safe Haven that seems to be in charge of its security systems. Anyways, let's give this unused dialogue a listen.
Izzy, have you done what I asked you to? Gathered all your things?
Oh, yeah! I've got my journal and my crayons and my dolly and my...
Good. Good, I just wanted to make sure.
You sound sad.
No, just thinking.
Thinking about what?
About everything to come. About our part in it.
Oh. Okay. Are we still gonna play our game later? You promised we would.
I remember, kiddo. And a good scout knows to keep her promises.
Yes!
But finish up your tasks first, please. Then my time is all yours.
Okay, I'll get them done quick! Super quick! You won't even see me do them!
That better mean they're actually getting done, though.
Now this file is found in a folder for the player's second visit back to the Safe Haven. And as we saw in my video covering the early versions of the chapter's areas, the Bobby Bear Hug there was named Izzy. So this dialogue was very likely to have been meant to play here, as we have Scout and Izzy facing each other. Now, as you heard, the exchange was honestly kinda sad, as it seems like Scout was planning on evacuating the Safe Haven with the other critters, as they probably deemed it unsafe at this point. And I don't know why this ended up getting scrapped, as I think this and other dialogue like this would have done wonders for this chapter's environmental storytelling, and it would have made the player feel more attached to these characters here, as opposed to them just mostly being voiceless, static parts of the Safe Haven backdrop. And then, sort of similar to this, there's also a scrapped audio file for the medic bot seen in the Safe Haven as well. And I don't know what you think, but to me, this seems like it's pretty unfinished.
Friend going to be okay. She stronger than she think.
Now this line is also found in the folder for the second visit, and I'm assuming the she being referred to in this clip is Kissy Missy, as she, I guess, was planned to still be seen in the Safe Haven recovering from her previous injuries, but in the final cut of this chapter, she's just not there the second visit. And as such, the medic bot just awkwardly sits there with no dialogue. And now that I think of it, it's unclear where Kissy Missy even is at this point in the chapter, as she's not seen anywhere else in the area, but I guess based on these voice lines from the medic bot, she might have once been planned to still be here. And then also for the second visit back to the Safe Haven, there's a small scrapped line for Poppy asking if the player obtained the Omni Hand. And not only do we have the audio for it left over, but there's an accompanying animation for Poppy as well.
Do you have it? The Omni Hand?
Now it seems likely that this line was to be used when the player returned to the Safe Haven area after getting the Omni Hand, but having another hand equipped when approaching Poppy. But normally in the final game, regardless of which hand you have equipped, she'll just note that you did in fact find the Omni Hand.
You have it! The Omni Hand!
And then last, but absolutely not least, for the scrapped Safe Haven voice clips, there are a pair of lines related to Doey's side quest that, just like the side quest itself, ended up going unused. And similar to the Poppy line previous, not only are the audio files for these left over, but lip-sync animations of Doughy speaking them are as well. Now, as we saw back in my first video on this chapter, the side quest for Doughy would have tasked the player with finding and bringing him back a book. And, well, I'll let the unused dialogue here speak for itself. First, we have the audio that would have seemingly played when the player would approach Doughy when first able to take on side quests.
Hey, if you... well, that is, if you have the time, there's something else I'd like you to watch out for. It's... The Adventures of the Word Wizard! It's a book, an old favorite of ours. If you happen to find it around here, could you bring it back to me?
And then secondly, there's also the scrapped dialogue that would have been used after the player found the book and brought it back to Doughy.
You found it! I... Thank you! It may not seem like much, but this is... well, it's a reminder. We used to read this all the time in the orphanage. All of us lined up in a circle on the floor. And even after having heard it 1,000 times, even if you were too young to really get the meaning, each and every face would still be smiling the second the first word was read. I think we need a little of that again before... Anyway, thank you. I won't forget this.
Now, interestingly, this isn't the only time that the Adventures of the Word Wizard is mentioned in this chapter either, as it's also referenced in one of the notes that you can find in the game as well. Now, just like some of the other scrapped voice lines, I think it's a shame that this was scrapped, as it would have helped us sympathize with Doughy and the critters in the safe haven even more. And Doughy's animations here are super expressive too, so it's too bad that this was cut. Then, in addition to all of these voice clips, there also appears to be 4 sound effects meant for the scrapped side quests as well. There's one for picking up a can of frosting, I guess related to Izzy's birthday cake. A drawing sound effect, likely for when the player would have to pose for Ed to draw a portrait. There's one for a poster tearing. And this one doesn't immediately appear to be related to any of the side quests we saw in the developer notes, but it might be related to how one of the event paths was originally planned to be covered by a poster, as we saw in another dev comment. And then lastly, there's another unused sound effect of some shackles being picked up and put down. And this one also doesn't immediately seem to be related to any of the quests listed in the dev notes, but maybe it was part of getting Kickin' Chicken his revenge or something. And then lastly, for the unused audio here, there are actually a few audio clips that appear to be placeholders that were quickly recorded off the cuff by one of the developers. These include a pair of placeholder audio clips for the Doctor, one for him retreating.
Man, f this, I'm out of here.
Another one for him getting deactivated.
Fuck you, I'm going back to sleep.
And then there are also a pair of unused clips listed as being meant for the train audio, presumably the Doctor's monologue, starting as well as ending.
The train is starting! The train is starting! The light turned on, there's smoke, it's all looping, which we gotta turn off when another sequencer plays. It's starting! Hey, this is the sound of you leaving the level.
Now, it should be no surprise as to why these were cut, but I just think they're hilarious, and I'm glad these were left over for us here to enjoy. Now, next up, one thing I mentioned in a previous video is that there were 2 areas that were seemingly scrapped between the No Man's Land and Doctor's Domain sections in this chapter, as they're internally listed as the 9th and 12th areas of the chapter respectively. Of course, leaving the 10th and 11th missing. Well, although lacking an actual map left over like the other ones, I did actually find the 10th and 11th levels referenced in the files, with the 10th one being referred to as an abandoned production area, and then the scrapped 11th map is referred to as Critter Tunnels. And although not certain, you could probably speculate that maybe the Critter Tunnels were reworked into the area leading up to the Foundation or something, but regardless, yeah, at least where these are placed in the sequence of the game's levels, these two areas were cut. Next, there's actually an alternate version of Chapter 4's intro cutscene with several differences that can be noted. Now, it's definitely a case of quantity over quality though for these differences, as most of them are pretty minor. And as you can see on this list of differences made up by my pal Galantark here, there's at least a few too many to do a deep dive into all of them here. But highlights include some clips being shorter, different camera angles being used for some of the shots, there's a different phone number here, and then the biggest change, at least in my opinion, is that, well, besides this section not being censored, this unused variant actually uses what seems to be raw audio from the home video recording section, rather than dubbed voiceovers that were used in the used version of this cutscene. Here's a comparison of both of those sections to illustrate how different they sound.
I knew it! This is the one I wanted! I knew it! This is the one I wanted!
There's a card too, dear. Open the card. There's a card too. Open the card.
So yeah, although there are several more minor differences, most of them are still pretty interesting I think, and it's pretty cool that this seemingly early version is still left over in the files. Now, moving along to the models and textures, there are a few found left over unused in this chapter too. First, for the textures, there's this poster of a cute little wolf fella, fittingly just titled Wolf. And of course, we also have some text here. On the top, we have Varg and Hauge, both of which appear to be of Scandinavian or Old Norse origins, with Varg translating to wolf and Hauge translating to hill or mound, so Wolf Hill. And then we also have some Japanese text on the bottom here translating to Varg as well. So I guess Varg is the name of this wolf here. Now I'm not sure if this is from some other media or something, but yeah, I couldn't find this poster anywhere in the chapter myself. Then next, in the files, I found a model of this warning sign featuring a skull and crossbones, an arrow symbolizing electricity, and what looks to be some Polish text. Now, I didn't check every single warning in this game, but I did check a lot of them, and I couldn't find this sign. But in addition to this grungy texture that's applied to this model, the full texture file actually contains what looks to be real-world photos of several other signs as well, including a slightly cleaner version of it with a red arrow and all of the text visible, where it says "Nie dotykać urządzenie elektryczne," which translates from Polish to "do not touch electrical device." And then we also have these other signs in yellow, red, and white, each with different letters and numbers, and personally, I'm not sure what the rest of these denote. And then last up for the textures here for this video, we have this one featuring photos of several kids. Now this photo is seen in the chapter in the memorial room, and then we saw this fella as a placeholder image on the monitors in the early version of the autopsy room. But I don't recall seeing the photos of any of these other kids in this chapter. And I don't know if these are childhood photos of some of the devs or something, and even though AI is getting better and better at generating photos of humans now, I think these photos seem to be real. If any of the devs end up watching this video, be sure to let us know. And now moving on to the three-dimensional side of things, first, we saw this model in the early map of the Doctor's Domain, and that's this arm model, referenced in the game simply as effigy, that was seemingly used there as a placeholder for the second blue hand you obtain in the morgue room. Now for those that don't know, an effigy is typically a roughly made sculpture or model to represent a person or object. But since this arm doesn't seem to match any of the currently known characters in the series, we don't really know who this is supposed to be an effigy of. Now, in a previous video, I mentioned how there's a possibility that this could be related to a jester-looking character that was teased in an ARG leading up to this chapter's release. And although we didn't end up seeing a character of this nature in this chapter, the features on the shoulder of this model definitely make it seem like it is for a jester-themed character. And of course, as you've been seeing, the connector in the shoulder here also very much looks like a key, so it's entirely possible that this arm was going to be used as a key item that the player would have had to pick up and use to open up another area. Either way, I think it's kind of weird that a character was so subtly teased only to not show up at all, but maybe we'll see more of this jester and what this arm could have been for in future chapters. Next up, although obviously several toys are seen throughout Chapter 4 here, one that isn't is Daddy Longlegs. But there's actually a model for him left over in the files, and we also saw this in the early version of the Doctor's Domain autopsy area as well on one of the tables. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think we've ever actually seen a Daddy Longlegs model in one of the chapters. So although it seems like he was initially planned to appear in the autopsy section before getting scrapped, at least we have an actual official model for him now, although there's no texture to go with it, unfortunately. And then lastly for the models here, another one we saw in the early maps is this early version of Riley, the one child that was turned into a toy creature seen at the start of the chapter before getting into the prison. And although not unused obviously, the final version of this character's model is simply referred to as Crate Toy, which I guess, yeah, makes sense. It just seemed kind of blunt considering how deep the environmental storytelling for this character was. And then also not unused, but a thing I found interesting is that there are 3 different models of Kissy Missy in this chapter. One basic normal one, a second one with her injured arm in a sling, and then the third sling-less one that's seen towards the ending of the game. And this one is straight up just titled Kissy Detachable Arm. And now last up for this video is a bit of an oddity with the Doctor's Eye video that's seen inside of the prison cell cube thing that you enter in order to get into the prison. So, although it appears here, it turns out that the video on the screen is actually synced up to the audio that's heard as the player rides up the elevator to the Doc's HQ. Now, in the final version of this chapter, there's no monitor on the elevator for this video to be displayed, but this certainly seems to suggest that there was one supposed to be, or at the very least, this video was supposed to be seen on the numerous monitors just as you hop off the elevator, instead of just the static scrolling and brief iClip that's normally seen. Here's what the Doctor's monologue sounds like with the video as it was seemingly intended.
Do you hear it? Like I do. Off somewhere. Somewhere. Far. Beyond this place. Beyond any place. A bell. For whom does it toll, you think? A wounded little pup lifts its head beneath the shadow of the master's raised foot. For whom does that bell now toll?
And then similarly, for the section just after this, where the player gets tossed down to the lower floor, there's a video of the Doctor's line here also meant to be seen on a monitor. But for whatever reason, this also doesn't appear to be used in the section where the line is heard.
Not even the ground beneath your feet.
Now, it's unclear why exactly these videos weren't used in this area as they were seemingly intended. Maybe there were some complications with getting them to play with the audio on the dozens of TVs in this room. But either way, I think it's kind of interesting that they reused the first video in the train segment, even if it was for a completely different set of lines from the Doctor. Alright, so let's kick things off with chatting about some early artwork that was shared by several artists who worked on this chapter. First up, we have several concept sketches for the game's environments made by Benjamin Yim, and these include some concept sketches of various areas, including this small room containing a power puzzle, as well as VHS tape right beside the VCR, and this might have been a concept sketch for the room near the train yard that takes you to the prison's interior. And then also related to the train station, we have this document sharing 3 different styles of train platforms with different materials used on the platform and rails, as well as different light posts, and we can see 2 images for the bottom 2 that were presumably used as references. And then to top it all off for the train stuff, there's this document showing 9 different color combinations for the front of the train. Now, normally it's really hard to tell what the colors are of the train in the final version of this chapter with the low lighting here, and I'll let you guess which one of these color combos was chosen. Alright, got your answer locked in? Well, whatever you chose, you're actually wrong, as none of these were chosen, as the train is mostly red in the game with a yellow top on the back and yellow headlight things, although it looks like the actual lights never ended up getting added into the game. Next up, we have the room that you fall down into the pit with Pianosaurus in this chapter, and I think this artwork looks awesome, but then we also have a trio of early sketches for this area too, where in these notes we can actually see that the design of this area was heavily inspired by both a zoo and actually the movie Jurassic World, as 2 reference images here with their notes show that the ledge the player falls down from, as well as some planned vegetation that didn't end up getting implemented, were both inspired from the raptor domain from that movie. Then next up, there's this concept art of one of the security control rooms from the prison, and although it looks pretty similar to how they're seen in the final game, albeit with a different control console here, one thing I found interesting in this artwork is in the back of the room we can see what looks like a train map as well as photos of several toys, I guess indicating where they were being held or something. And here, we of course got some familiar faces like Huggy, PJ Pugapillar, Daisy, as well as a few of the smiling critters. But then we also got a pair of other creatures here that I don't recognize at all. Not sure if these are characters from something else, or maybe placeholder early versions of Doey and Yarnaby or something, but if you recognize these, be sure to let us know down in the comments below. Then after this, we have this bit of concept art of the prison's main hub area that, although similar to how it's seen in the final version of this chapter, some differences here include the colors being in a different order, both on the lines on the floor as well as on the square prison logo up here. There's no fencing surrounding the central desk, and then the back of this room is directly labeled as an office on the door here, instead of on the floor, leading up to the wardens and other offices there. Next, we have several concept sketches of the square and circular resistors that you replace in the Safe Haven's generator with various different connector design ideas. And then we also have this more finalized design for the circular one, and interestingly, in both of these we got some concept artception, as in their top lefts, we can see some concept art for the generator itself, and then even deeper, there's what looks to actually be a screenshot from an early test map of some sort, with an also early model of the generator that somebody whipped up. And although it's pretty blurry here, since this is such a small part of this document, we can see the devs even labeling what the various components of the generator here are. Next, we got some art of the prison yard, where aside from the tower numbers and which one is obscured, it looks pretty close to how it's seen in the final version of this area. But one thing that caught my eye was the one chain here being found under this minecart. Now, if you watched my previous videos, you may recall that one of the dev notes indicated that the original plan was for one of the chains to be under a minecart, which the player would have to move off of it, and this didn't end up being the case in the final game, but it looks like this sketch was made with that idea in mind. Then, we also have this document in which we can see some earlier art for this area, but in these 2 bottom images, the cart is still seen covering the chain here. So I guess there might have been some explicit instructions given to make sure that this was included in the sketches. And then, as you saw earlier, this document also has several different design concepts for the yard towers here in different shapes and styles too. Next, we have some art for the Doctor's domain area, first of which are actually a surprising number of concept sketches for the buzzsaw machine seen in the morgue room. We got several different sketches, including different designs for the arm, as well as different ideas for how it would move, including different wheel configurations, as well as a pair of sketches with the machine on rails. And then there's also this document with a more finalized design, both with a movable cart as well as without one. Then after this, we have several different concept designs for the gas mask filter dispensing machine. The general idea is the same with the big red button, but there are also various ideas here for how the filters would be dispensed and if there would be a display on the machine or not. And then in this document with the more finalized design, interestingly, despite the final canisters only having a yellow stripe on an otherwise black cylinder, here we have seemingly early ideas for them appearing in red, yellow, and/or blue. Now, based on its model, it seems like the gas mask normally takes yellow filters, but it's interesting to me to see these other colors here, and I wonder if there were any sort of plans for them to offer a different amount of oxygen to the player or something. Then after this, my favorite concept sketches for this part of the game are for the Doctor's headquarters, and first, we have this panopticon-like observation area that looks like it would have been suspended from the ceiling with lights, speakers, and other things underneath it, and based on this human figure here being used as a size reference for these ducts, it seems like those are perhaps how the player would have entered and left this building. Now, I guess we did get something sort of similar in the final version of this chapter, as there's some windows under the elevator that takes you up to the Doctor, but it's definitely not as cool looking or fleshed out as this is. And I think it's a shame, because I think this looks awesome, and this would have been really cool to see above leading up to the Doctor, as well as during the final fight against Dowie. And how do I know that that's where this was going to be, you might be wondering? Well, we actually have another set of concept sketches here, where one of them actually shows that this observation/central light source was in fact conceptualized to be there in the middle of the area. Then the rest of this sheet shows off various different ideas for the Doctor's headquarters, including different configurations of screens and their designs. Two of the concepts here had a bunch of toys hanging from the ceiling, and then several of these would have leaned more into the HQ being in a cave-like setting compared to the more developed design that we ended up seeing. And then of course, there are different ideas here for how the Doctor himself would be seen. Rather than just a central unit with his brain, other ideas here include the Doctor being hooked up to the central computer in one of the TV-headed robots, either just standing, seemingly at the controls of some sort of console, or my favorite, sitting on a throne. And honestly, I think pulling up to the Doctor sitting on a throne like this would have been super badass to see in this chapter. And now lastly here, for the environment concept sketches, we got some for the crusher grinder thing that's used to finally defeat Dowie towards the end of this chapter, where here we can see a different design of the machine with fewer canisters of liquid nitrogen. And then much like some of the other objects earlier, here too we have various different design ideas for this grinder as well. Now before we go on, not found in any of the concept sketches I saw, but rather in a picture of the Poppy Playtime pop-up store that opened up in Japan, on this backdrop of the prison entrance here, I actually noticed a small difference that isn't seen in the game. And this is the text above the entrance door. The Shelf, seemingly a code name for the prison or something. Now, I couldn't find any other references to the Shelf in the game, but I just find this incredibly odd that it's seen here in this promotional shot of this entrance. Though I do think a nickname like this for the prison would have been a cool idea. Now, next up for this video, let's move on to some concept art for the characters, first of which are several for the Doctor himself drawn up by Robert Coe. Now, for starters, gonna speculate here, but overall it seems like the original idea for the Doctor was not for there to be numerous robots that he'd take control of in his headquarters, as is seen in this chapter, but rather he'd just be one robot that you'd encounter, or at the very least he'd be a special main one with some blue garment under his outer lab coat cloak. And why do I think this? Well, a few reasons actually. Namely, there's this sheet with sketches of the Doctor leaning over and killing a critter, an idea of him towering over and looking down at the protagonist, an uncloaked version of the robot that reveals what looks to be the Doctor's heart encased inside the robot, and then what convinces me the most is we have this sheet featuring several reaction screens for the Doctor's TV, most of which didn't make it into the final cut. And the subtext for these seems like there was once planned to actually be a battle against one Doctor Robot, rather than just evading many of them. Now this is of course not 100% confirmed and all just my speculation, but this one especially makes me think that the originally planned encounter with the Doctor was once much different than how we end up seeing it. And some of these screens are pretty wild. I think only the top row and the yellow pulled apart eye is seen in the game, but yeah, these other ones look super cool and I think it's too bad that they didn't end up getting used. Now overall, I found the Doctor encounter pretty underwhelming in this chapter personally, especially with how much he was gassed up in the trailers leading up to release, so I think it's interesting to see that plans for his role in this chapter may have once been a bit different. Then after this, we have some more bits of character concept art, this time from Amber Ogden. First of which is the concept sketch for none other than LIMON, which was super cool to see. And here we also got photos of some eyepieces and what looks to be a real photo of a lemon peel that were used as a reference. Next, there's this sheet of concept art of Yarnaby doing Yarnaby things. The sketches here all look fairly similar to his final design, maybe just a bit skinnier here, but as a fellow cat enjoyer, my favorite of these has to be this sketch of Yarnaby being held with him just ragdolling like a cat. And then finally for the character sketches here, we also have some for Dowie. And although his appearance looks similar again here, interestingly, none of these sketches depict Dowie as a nice guy at all. And instead, they're all of him in an antagonistic vibe, with him even saying some very mean things. These sketches here range from pretty goofy to nightmare fuel, with Dowie ripping his face off, having an incredibly creepy face, as well as having several arms emerging from his mouth, similar to what we do see in his final monster design in this chapter. But my favorite of the sketches here though has to be this one in a scrapped idea where Dowie would like flex his arm, and then dough models of the antagonists of the game's 3 prior chapters, Huggy Wuggy, Mommy Longlegs, and Catnap, would form. And I just think this would have been really cool to see in this chapter. Now, based on all of these sketches, especially this one, it looks like Dowie may not have undergone as big of a transformation to a different design as we see in the final version of this chapter, and instead, he would have mostly retained his regular look, but just would have cranked his meanness level to 11. And this idea is actually also exemplified in this other bit of concept art for an idea where Dowie would have pulled up and confronted both the player as well as Kissy Missy. And again, although seemingly already going full send with opposing the player, overall, he still retains his normal look. And despite how creepy the monster Dowie is in the game, something about him still looking happy like this while trying to kill the player would be very unsettling too. And interestingly, Amber also shared the process of how this art was made from its original rough sketch to a rough grayscale all the way to the final version, and I think this was super cool to see. And lastly for the sketches, for this video at least, similar to the ones we covered back in Chapter 2, there are actually several storyboard sketches that were shared by their artist, Scott Forrester, which give us an early look at how certain scenes were planned to be animated for this chapter. Starting in the top left of this video here, featuring 4 scenes, we have an early look at Pianosaurus's short appearance in this chapter and how he gets attacked by Dowie. And yeah, here it seems to play out exactly the same as it does in the final version of this chapter. Then next, we have Dowie's transformation here, and although only slightly different to how it's seen in the game, the subtitles here seem to show some different lines for Dowie's monologue that aren't used in the final cut. Then we have Yarnaby in his observation room here, where after jumping towards the player and attacking the glass for a bit, he then starts to like wave or paw at the window, which I thought was pretty funny. Another interesting difference here is that this shows the doctor's eye on the TV in this room. Now this TV is still in this room in the final version of this area, so I guess the intention was to display his eye here, much like we see it in the train segment, but as I covered in my last video, it looks like the implementation of the Doctor's TV videos wasn't exactly perfected, so that might be why the devs chose to just not use this TV here. And then last up for this first video, we have a storyboard for Yarnaby's death sequence, where it looks like originally, the idea was for Yarnaby to get tangled up in a bunch of hooks and chains, instead of just the one that we see in the final version of his demise. And here, we also don't see him catching fire or anything, so perhaps the original idea for his bamboozlement here didn't involve fire at all, and he would just go out like this. And speaking of Yarnaby catching fire, there's actually one more storyboard sequence that was shared, and it's of the protagonist straight up just blasting Yarnaby with the flare gun hand, which would cause him to combust into a pile of ash. Yeah. Now I'm not sure how seriously planned this storyboard was, as this seems like it would have been a way too easy way to defeat Yarnaby. And he just looks so non-threatening in the storyboard, like he just wants to play, which makes this kinda sad. And now, let's move on from the static concept art and get to talking about several early and unused animations that were shared by some of the other developers. First, for Poppy herself, animated by Malachi Breckenridge, we have an unused walking cycle where she'd hold up her dress a bit as she'd walk around. Now, when asked why this animation didn't end up getting used, apparently the rig for Poppy's model underwent significant adjustments, and as a result, this animation ended up being canned. Then also from Malachi, we have a video comparing animations for Pianosaurus's Munchin as well as the death scene. Now, the actual animations of Pianosaurus seem to be the same, but of course here, these animations are taking place in some sort of basic placeholder rooms, and we also don't have any of the final lighting effects either. Next for Doughy, first we have a behind the scenes look at Doughy's animation of him spaghetting through the bars here in a placeholder version of the cave area made by Taylor Lanning. And Taylor also shared an early animation of Doughy's interaction with Poppy and the player just before you're tasked with repairing the generator. And in addition to seeing an untextured Doughy here, we can also see an early, equally untextured safe haven towards the end of this clip, which I thought was awesome as it looks so incredibly basic. And then lastly from Taylor here, we also have this unused animation of Yarnaby stalking. And yeah, let's address the elephant in the room, he's yarnless here. And I've seen many call him Baldaby or just Ubby, since there's no yarn. Now I can only assume that Yarnaby's yarn hair just wasn't fully developed at this point or something, but whatever the case may be, seeing Yarnaby like this is pretty epic, and don't you worry, we'll be seeing lots more of him like this. Like next, we have some early animation clips from Achebe Spencer, whose early content we've been seeing since all the way back in Chapter 1, I believe. And these include Baldaby's reveal with him jumping at the player in the observation room, a running animation, one of him both entering and exiting a vent, him patrolling the server room, and then my favorite of the bunch, there's this one of Yarnaby trying to reach the player after they escape into a vent. And yeah, all of these just look super cursed. Then Achebe also shared a behind-the-scenes look at the animations made for the Doughy commercial seen in the intro cutscene. And not only did I think it was really cool to see these animations in a basic placeholder area, but in the top left here we can also see the real-life recordings Doughy-less. And other differences in this recording are this picture frame lacking any picture inside of it, and then in the next shots with the fridge and the toy train with the basketball, in both shots, we can see a stainless steel fridge instead of the white one that's seen in the final version of the cutscene. Now otherwise, these shots appear to be the exact same, so it looks like the devs actually added in like a fake white fridge in post-editing, as I guess perhaps the stainless steel one looks too modern for the 1992 time period that it seems this intro tape was taking place in. And although the text is quite hard to read since this video is so small, this seems to be confirmed, as the text here appears to read, "Fridge needs CG replacement for reflections and to be time period accurate." It certainly makes sense, but I don't know, I just thought it was interesting to see that they ended up swapping out the fridge like this. And also, there's this short animation of Doughy smiling and holding up a finger, which doesn't normally get seen as the commercial cuts to the kids gasping. And then my favorite thing in this clip is we can see a behind the scenes look at how this brief shot of Doughy popping up behind the kids was done. As we can see where the camera is placed here, aiming at the real life recording with Doughy offset further back. Honestly, really cool to see how they pulled this off. And then last but absolutely not least, we have numerous behind the scenes animation tests shared by Alex Sentel. What a profile picture. For Yarnaby, we got idle animations of him looking around and sniffing, as well as one of him doing a shake-stretch combo, as some cats like to do. Then there's hairless Yarnaby appearing in the first chase hallway, as well as an accompanying jump scare animation test. And then there's also this clip of Yarnaby's death animation, just lacking him catching fire here. Next, we got a bunch for the Doughman, including him glooping through the crack in the prison yard, him moving his extended head just after that section in this really basic hallway, his animation seen in the safe haven when he wants to talk to the player alone in the generator room, which here looks kinda weird since the face lip sync animations weren't added yet. And then there's also an animation sequence that ended up getting cut from the game, and it's of Doughy peeking around a corner, but then getting blocked as the path gets caved in, after which he then looks towards us with suspicion. Now in the description of this video, Alex Sentel confirms that this animation was planned to be seen later in the game, as Doughy gets more and more suspicious of the protagonist. And based on the train tracks here, I think it's likely that this might have been planned for the cave section leading up to the foundation area that would have doubled as a fancy way to prevent the player from backtracking. But whatever the case may be, I really like this animation, and I think it would have been cool to see more hints of Doughy getting suspicious of the protagonist's actions and intentions as we progressed through the chapter. And then lastly, we have a test animation of the final scene in this chapter where we get an injured Huggy Wuggy running towards the protagonist after they get locked up in the room leading up to the laboratories. Now Huggy's animation looks to be similar, if not the same, but what I thought was interesting is that his model actually appears a bit different here. As we saw in my first Lost Bits video on this chapter, getting a closer look at Huggy, we saw his injuries stuffed with some white gauze. And this model here doesn't seem to have that gauze, leaving his wounds appearing much more exposed and essentially just being held together with some rope. Now I can't really say one looks more gory than the other, but still, interesting that it seemingly got changed in the first place. Now I think it's awesome that the artists and animators shared all of this early work with us online, and it's really cool that they were allowed to do so. Not every company is as transparent with their early development processes. If any of the artists or devs end up watching this video, thank you for sharing. Your work is awesome. Alright, so for starters, one thing I mentioned in a previous video is this concept artwork of the prison cell control room drawn up by Benjamin Yim, where in the back here we noted several of the game's characters on what looks like a train map of sorts. And of these character photos here, 2 of them stood out. Now I thought that maybe these could have been early conceptual designs of Doughy as well as Yarnaby, but as many of you had pointed out, this fella here is apparently a photo of a bootleg plush of Killy Willy. Now personally, I still don't really see too much of a resemblance, especially the ears, but hey, I guess I'm wrong. And then secondly, at the time of upload, no one really seemed to know who this blue fella here was. That is until a few days ago as of the making of this video, when an artist by the name of Corey revealed on Twitter that this photo here is actually of another bootleg plush, this time being designed from an old sketch of Catnap that actually predated the release of Chapter 3. Yeah, so apparently this art was made around the time the second teaser for Poppy Playtime Chapter 3 was put out, where, at the time, all we saw of Catnap was his paw in the thumbnail, as well as an obscured look at his face. And due to this, no one really knew what exactly Catnap looked like at the time, and that's evident here as this tie-wearing design appears much more like a bear than a cat. And here we also have some art for, I guess, Crafty Corn and a Chica-looking kickin' chicken. Now, to avoid any sort of confusion, this isn't official concept art from Mob Entertainment, so it's certainly not confirmed that Catnap was originally designed as a bear or anything. But still, I think it's pretty funny that this bootleg plush that was derived from a guess of Catnap's design ended up finding its way into this concept sketch here. Now, I ended up asking the original artist of this concept sketch to confirm 100% who these characters here are, but as of the making of this video, I haven't yet gotten a response. Now next up, as I make this video, there was actually an update to the game that changed a few things, including updating the lighting, added some voice lines from Ollie, and what I think is most striking are the additions of some new sequences for both Yarnaby's death as well as the Doctor's, which I think was a welcome addition, as these certainly make these sequences more impactful. Now, the reason I bring these up is that there was actually some content removed in Yarnaby's End, and this is the large vat of molten whatever used to be here in prior builds, and was supposed to be, I guess, what caused Yarnaby to catch fire after he got hooked. And yeah, this was removed in favor of Yarnaby dropping down into this pool of molten whatever, which causes him to burn up Terminator 2 style. And I think this certainly is an improvement over what we originally got. Now, before we go on, a quick shout out to GamerSubs. Check them out for some delicious sugar-free, no-filler drinks in both their energy formula as well as caffeine-free alternative for those who don't want or can't have caffeine. Links in the description where you can grab some free samples and use code TETRA at checkout to save 10% on your order. And now secondly for this video, in part 4 we went over a bunch of early and test animations made by Malachi Breckenridge. And a few days ago, Malachi dumped a whole near 2 minutes worth of additional ones. Now, most of these are early tests of animations that did go on to be used in the final cut of this chapter, but some of these seem to reveal a few more concepts that were scrapped. Starting with the tests of animations we did end up seeing in Chapter 4, here we have Doughy in his monster form running. And it looks like this animation wasn't exactly fully finished at this time, as only Doughy's front 4 arms are animated. As we can see, the back 4 are just static and stretched out in, I guess, whatever version of a T-pose you'd want to call this. And yeah, I just thought it looked pretty funny. Another thing that's interesting is that it looks like the internal working name for Doughy in his monster form was Doughy Stalker. Next up, we have an early test animation for the bit where one of the Doctor robot fellas drops down from above after scooping up one of the batteries in the maze section there. And there's also the accompanying animation of the robot extending his hand out as he does when he rushes toward you after he drops. Next, we can get a very early look at the animation of Doughy giving the protagonist a battery just before the small gear puzzle maze bit leading up to the safe haven. And here, not only is everything untextured, but we can actually also see the tris and quads of the model here too, which is pretty neat. After this, there's an early test of Doughy chucking down the Dog Day toy to get the player another lever in the prison yard area in a more finished, unlit state, as well as, more interestingly, this one in an untextured blockout map. And then another fun tidbit that I don't think everyone noticed is that the pose that the toy ends up falling into is actually the Family Guy death pose from the episode where Peter Griffin keeps falling down his stairs. And this actually isn't the only instance where the devs snuck this death pose in, as towards the end of this chapter, one of the Kissy Missies can actually be found in this death pose in the safe haven after it goes boom. It's pretty hard to see if you're not specifically looking for it here, but yeah, another neat little Easter egg. And then lastly, for the animations in this reel that seem to have been used, we have some for the mini Huggies. We got one section for their animation when airborne after jumping, and then another for their recovery animation after landing back down on the ground. But then, in addition to these two, as a good segue to the unused animations in this reel, there's also an unused animation of another fall recovery, as the mini Huggies can be seen doing a shoulder roll as they hit the ground. Although I hated having to deal with the mini Huggies in this chapter, not gonna lie, these animations look hella clean, and I think it's too bad that it looks like they didn't end up getting used. Then after this, there's this animation of Doughy waving his hand, beckoning the player to follow him. And I don't recall this being seen anywhere, but it seems like this would have served a similar use to the few times that Doughy sticks his head out into a hallway to encourage the player to follow him. Then also for the Dough Man, we have this untextured test animation for him in his monster form taunting by like slamming the ground with his two front hands. Now this animation is still actually left in the game as a taunt 1, and there's also a taunt 2 that appears to be used whenever you break free from Doughy's grasp as he tries to pull you in. As such, it's possible and likely that this first taunt could have been used in a similar manner. And just like we saw with the running animation test earlier, when loading this animation onto Doughy in the game, we can again see the back arms just static and extended. And while we're talking about Doughy's model here, I didn't mention this in my previous videos, but there are actually two unused models of the fella left over in the game referred to as proxies. Now, proxy models are basically simplified models used as a placeholder when developing a game, and as such, it should come as no surprise that these are untextured and different compared to the final model. First, we got one just referred to as a proxy rig, and it's obviously quite basic with only 6 main arms and another 6 coming out of the mouth here, and we got 3 basic spheres representing Doughy's inner heads. And what I thought was extra funny is that despite being a basic model, they still bothered to model Doughy's hat here. The same can't be said for the next model with a PRX at the end of its file name. I'm assuming short for proxy again, and yeah, here, despite being more detailed, this one is hatless. And in addition to just being a bigger model, this fella has a whopping 15 extended hands on his main body, which is actually 5 more than the final model, and honestly, the more hands Doughy has, the creepier I think he gets. But yeah, just figured these were worth mentioning as I missed them for my previous videos. Anyways, back to the animations here. Next, we have a pair of unused protagonist death animations. First is one that's a bit more basic as it just has the player getting knocked down to the ground. And then the second one has the player dying on a meat hook in a death sequence that seems to have been completely scrapped as there's no hook on which the player can die in the final version of this chapter. So yeah, it's unclear where this would have fit in, as the player would seemingly get raised up after getting hooked like this, but the only plausible section I can think of is the Yarnaby death sequence, where perhaps if you messed something up, the protagonist would end up getting hooked instead. But that's not really a meat hook, so I guess if it was in fact supposed to be meat related, I suppose only the kitchen area leading up to the safe haven would have fit that bill. Now, I asked Malachi on Twitter for some more clarification for this animation, but just like with the concept art earlier, still waiting to hear back. But whatever the case may be, although the jump scare animations are neat, I think death animations like these would have been cool to see in this chapter too. And then last but not least for this reel's animations, it wraps up with showing an animation titled Crispy Critters. And yeah, it's just about exactly what it sounds like. Here we get to see 4 of the smiling critters get electrocuted, resulting in them getting cooked beyond well done, as they start to smoke a bit too. Now, there's only one section in the game where a smiling critter gets zapped, and it's in this section after the bit with Baba Chops. But even there, after getting zapped, the Simon Smoke doesn't get smoked, at least not nearly like this. So I'm assuming these animations here were tests of the critters getting zapped in this chamber thing, and yeah. I think seeing a critter get toasted like this would have made zapping this fella here that much more visceral.